Crookshanks, no! Cried the witch, but Scabbers shot from between her hands like a bar of soap, landed splay-legged on the floor, and then scampered for the door. Scabbers! Ron shouted, racing out of the shop after him. Harry followed. It took them nearly 10 minutes to catch Scabbers, who had taken refuge under a wastepaper bin outside Quality Quidditch Supplies. Ron stuffed the trembling back rat into his pocket and straightened up, massaging his head. What was that? It was either a very big cat or quite a small tiger, said Harry. Where's Hermione? Probably getting her owl. They made their way back up to the crowded streets of the magical menagerie, and then they reached it. Hermione came out, but she wasn't carrying an owl. Her arms was clamped very tightly around an enormous ginger cat. You bought that monster? Said Ron, his mouth hanging open. He's gorgeous, isn't he? Said Hermione, glowing. That was a matter of opinion, thought Harry. The cat's ginger fur was thick and fluffy, but it was definitely a bit bow-legged, and its face looked grumpy and oddly squashed, though it had run headlong into a brick wall. Now that Scabbers was out of sight, however, the cat was purring contentedly in Hermione's arms. Hermione, that thing nearly scalped me, said Ron. He didn't mean to, did you, Crookshanks? Said Hermione. And what about Scabbers? Said Ron, pointing at the lump in his chest pocket. He needs rest and relaxation. How's he going to get that with that thing around? Oh, that reminds me, you forgot your rat tonic, said Hermione, slapping a small red bottle in Ron's hand. And stop worrying. Crookshanks will be sleeping in my dormitory and Scabbers in yours. What's the problem? Poor Crookshanks. That witch said he'd been there for ages. No one wanted him. Huh. I wonder why, said Ron sarcastically, as they set off towards the leaky cauldron. They found Mr. Weasley sitting at the bar, reading the Daily Prophet. Harry, he said, smiling as he looked up. How are you? Fine, thanks, said Harry, as he, Ron, and Hermione joined Mr. Weasley with all their shopping. Mr. Weasley put down his paper, and Harry saw the now familiar picture of Sirius Black staring up at him. They haven't caught him yet, then? He asked. No, said Mr. Weasley, looking extremely grave. They've pulled us all up for regular jobs in the ministry to try to find him, but no luck so far. Would we get a reward if we caught him? Asked Ron. It'd be good to get some more money. Don't be ridiculous, Ron, said Mr. Weasley, who, on closer inspection, looked very strained. Black's not going to be caught by a 13-year-old wizard. It's the Azkaban guards who'll get him back. You mark my words. And at that moment Mrs. Weasley entered the bar, laden with shopping bags, followed by the twins, George, Fred, and George, and who were about to start their 5th year at Hogwarts, and newly elected head boy, Percy, and the Weasleys' youngest child, and only girl, Ginny. Ginny, who had always been very taken with Harry, seemed even more heartily embarrassed than usual when she saw him, perhaps because he had saved her life during the previous year. She went very red and muttered, "Hello," without even looking at him. Percy, however, held out his hand solemnly as though he and Harry had never been met and said, "Harry, how nice to see you." "Hello, Percy," said Harry, trying not to laugh. "I hope you're well," said Percy pompously, shaking hands. It was rather like being introduced to the mayor. Yeah, very well, thanks." "Harry," said Fred, elbowing Percy out of the way and bowing deeply, "simply splendid to see you, old boy." "Marvellous," said George, pushing Fred aside and seizing Harry's hand in turn. "Absolutely spiffing." Percy scowled. "That's enough now," said Mrs. Weasley. "Mom," said Fred, as though he had just spotted her seizing her hand too. "How really corking to see you." "I said that's enough," said Mrs. Weasley, depositing her shopping in an empty chair. "Hello, Harry dear. Oh, I suppose you've heard our exciting news." She pointed to the brand new silver badge on Percy's chest. "Second head boy in the family," she said, swelling with pride. At last, Fred muttered under his breath. I don't doubt that, said Mrs. Weasley, frowning suddenly. I noticed the two of you, that they haven't made you two prefects. What do you want us to be prefects for? Said George, looking revolted at the very idea. I'd take all the fun out of life. Ginny giggled. You want to set a better example for your sister, snapped Mrs. Weasley. Ginny, on the other boys, to set her an example, mother, said Percy loftily. I'm going to change for dinner. He disappeared, and George heaved a sigh. We tried to shut him up in the pyramid, he told Harry, but Mom spotted us. Dinner that night was a very enjoyable affair. Tom, the innkeeper, put 3 tables together at the parlor, and the 7 Weasleys, Harry and Hermione, ate their way through 4 delicious courses. How are we getting to King's Crossing tomorrow, Dad? Asked Fred, as they dug into the sumptuous chocolate pudding. The Ministry's providing a couple of cars, said Mr. Weasley. Everyone looked up at him. Why? Asked Percy curiously. It's because of you, Percy, said George seriously. And there'll be little flags with hoods, with that say HB on them, for humongous big head, said Fred. Everyone except Percy and Mrs. Weasley snorted into their pudding. Why are the Ministry of Magic providing cars, Father? Percy asked again, in a dignified voice. Well, as we haven't got one any more, said Mrs. Weasley. And I worked out a favor. They're doing me a favor. His voice was casual, but Harry couldn't stop noticing that Mr. Weasley's ears had gone red, just like Ron's did when he was under pressure. Good thing, too, said Mrs. Weasley briskly. Oh, do you realize how much luggage you've all got between you? Nice sight you will be in the Muggle underground. You'll all be packed. Well, aren't you? You're all packed, aren't you? Ron had put all his new things in his trunk yet? Said Percy, in a long-suffering voice. He's dumped them on my bed. You'd better go back properly, Ron, because we won't have much time in the morning, Mrs. Weasley called down the table. Ron scowled at Percy. After dinner, everyone felt full and sleepy. One by one, they made their way upstairs to their rooms to check their things for the next day. Ron and Percy were next door to Harry. He had just closed and locked his own trunk when he heard an angry voices through the wall, and went to see what was going on. The door of number 12 was ajar, and Percy was shouting, It was here, on the bedside table. I took it off for polishing. I haven't touched it, all right, Ron roared back. What's up? Said Harry. My head boy badge is gone, said Percy, rounding on Harry. So Scabbers' rat tonic, said Ron, throwing out all of his trunk to look for it. I think I might have left it at the bar. You're not going anywhere till you found my badge, yelled Percy. I'll get Scabbers' stuff. I'm packed, Harry said to Ron, and he went downstairs. Harry was halfway along the passage of the bar when he was now a very dark and heard another pair of angry voices between them from the parlor. A second later, he recognized it was Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's. He hesitated, not wanting them to know he'd heard them arguing, and when the sound of his own name made him stop, they moved closer to the parlor door. Makes no sense not to tell him, Mr. Weasley sang her heatedly. Harry's got a right to know. I've tried to tell Fudge, but he insists on treating Harry like a child, like he's 13 years old, and Arthur, the truth would terrify him, said Mrs. Weasley shrilly. Do you really want to send Harry back to school with that hanging over him? For heaven's sake, he's happy not knowing. I don't want to make him miserable. I want to put him on his guard, retorted Mr. Weasley. You know what Harry and Ron are like, wandering off by themselves. They've even ended up in a forbidden forest. But Harry mustn't do that this year. When I think of what could have happened to him that night he ran away from home, if the night bus hadn't picked him up, I'm prepared to bet had been dead before the Ministry found him. But he's not dead. He's fine. So what's the point? Molly, they say Sirius Black's mad. And maybe he is, but he was clever enough to escape Azkaban, and that's supposed to be impossible. It's been a month, and no one's seen hide nor hair of him. I don't care what Fudge keeps telling the Daily Prophet. We're no nearer to catching Black than inventing a self-spelling wands. The only thing we know for sure is that Black's after. But Harry will be perfectly safe at Hogwarts. We thought Azkaban was perfectly safe. If Black can break out of Azkaban, he can break into Hogwarts. But no one's really sure that Black's after Harry. There was a thud of wood, and Harry was sure Mr. Weasley had banged his fist on the table. Molly, how many times do I have to tell you? They didn't report it in the press because Fudge wanted to keep it quiet. But Fudge went out to Azkaban that night. Black escaped. The guards told Fudge that Black's been talking in his sleep for a while now, always the same word. He's at Hogwarts. He's at Hogwarts. Black deranged Molly. He Black is deranged, Molly, and if he wants Harry dead, if you ask me, he thinks murdering Harry will bring you know who back to power. Black lost everything that night Harry stopped you know who, and he's had 12 long years in Azkaban to brood on that. There was a silence. Harry leaned closer to the door, desperately to hear more. Well, Arthur, you must do what you think is right, but you're forgetting Albus Dumbledore. I don't think anything could hurt Harry at Hogwarts while Dumbledore is a headmaster. I suppose he knows about all of this. Of course he knows. He had to ask him if he re- if he minds the Azkaban guards stationing themselves outside the entrance to the school grounds. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. Not happy? Why wouldn't he be happy? If they're there to catch Black, Dumbledore isn't fond of Azkaban guards. And Mr. Weasley heavily. Nor am I, if comes to that. But when you're dealing with a wizard like Black, you sometimes have to join forces with those you'd rather avoid. If they save Harry, and I will never another again say another word against them, Mr. Weasley said wearily. Oh, it's late, Molly. We'd better go up. And Harry heard chairs move. Quietly as he could, he hurried down the passage to the bar out of sight. The parlor door opened, and a few seconds later footsteps told him that Mr. and Mrs. Weasley were climbing the stairs. The bottle of rat tonic was lying under the table that had sat at earlier. Harry waited until he heard Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's bedroom door close, then headed back upstairs with the bottle. Fred and George were crouching in the shadows on the landing, heaving with laughter as they listened to Percy dismantling his own Ron's room in search of his badge. We've got it, Fred whispered to Harry. we have we've been improving it. The badge now read, Big Head Boy. Harry forced a laugh, went to give Ron the rat tonic, then shut himself in his room and lay down on his bed. So, Sirius Black was after him. That explained everything. Fudge had been lenient with him because he was so relieved to find him alive. He'd made Harry promise to stay at Diagon Alley, where there were plenty of wizards to keep an eye on him, and he was sending 2 ministry cars to take them all the way to the station tomorrow, so that the Weasleys could look after Harry until he was on the train. Harry lay listening to the muffled shouting next door and wondered why he didn't feel more scared. Sirius Black had murdered 13 people with one curse. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley obviously thought Harry should be panic stricken if he knew the truth. But Harry happened to agree wholeheartedly with Mrs. Weasley that the safest place on earth was wherever Albus Dumbledore happened to be. Didn't people always say that Dumbledore was the only person Lord Voldemort was ever been afraid of? Surely Black, as Voldemort's right-hand man, would have been just as frightened of him. And then there was the Azkaban guards everyone kept talking about. They seemed to scare most people senseless, and if they were stationed all around the school, Black's chances of getting inside seemed very remote. Now, all in all, things that had bothered Harry was the most fact that his chances of visiting Hogsmeade now looked like zero. Nobody would want Harry to leave safety of the castle until Black was caught. In fact, Harry suspected that every move would be carefully watched until the danger had passed. He scowled in the dark ceiling. Did they think he couldn't look for after himself? He escaped Lord Voldemort 3 times. He wasn't completely useless. Unbidden by the image of the beach of the shadows of the Magnolia Crescent crossed his mind. What do you do when you know the worst is coming? Hmm. I'm not going to be murdered, Harry said out loud. That's the spirit, dear, said the mirror sleepily.